Hello, my name is David Inman. I'm very excited to be here giving as part of this lecture series on typology and natural language processing. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the interdependence between language description, typology, and natural language processing. I will mostly use examples from a language called Nuuchahnulth, which is a Canadian language with which I have done some field work. When we introduce people to the field of linguistics, we typically give them the idea of relatively independent subfields of linguistics, which are carved up based on the facet of language one is looking at. A typical list looks something like this: phonology, which is just the study of sound structures; morphology, the study of meaningful parts of language; syntax, which studies order; semantics, pragmatics, and so on. We also will sometimes talk about linguistics as carved up by research theme. So examples here are things like sociolinguistics, which is the study of language and society, or sociological study generally; historical linguistics, which is the study of language change through time; language description, which is the describing of underdocumented or under-resourced languages; and sort of the newcomer to the group, computational linguistics or natural language processing. However, in reality, as most of us who work in the field are aware, linguistic research is not quite as segregated as we present it in introductory material. So a morphologist can't just study morphology, she has to also understand lexical semantics. A phonologist might need to consider phrase boundaries when he is understanding the intonation of or the other phonological structures of the language. So some knowledge of syntax is important. A sociolinguist can not only look at contemporary language change, but needs to know about historical changes to understand what's going on concurrently. And language documentation has to consider social factors when we go gather primary data. So all of these fields are a little bit more intertwined than we present it to introductory students. A more advanced view can look at linguistics in terms of what I'm going to call research themes. That is, sort of what set of goals or propositions or what view are you taking on the phenomenon of language? So the first sort of research theme is language description. So take a specific language and describe it, or describe particular properties of it. There's also formal linguistics. So this is any kind of formalization of language phenomena within some kind of rule-governed framework. There is typology, which is looking at language phenomena as they exist in the world. We also have language change, which sort of unites historical linguistics and sociolinguistics. So just viewing how can language change or vary, both concurrently and in the past. There is psycho or neurolinguistics, language use as a biological or mental process. And again, last but not least, natural language processing, which is processing natural language with the use of computational resources. And of course, there are other ways to carve the field up. I am going to focus mostly on language description, formal linguistics, typology, and NLP. A traditional view of how these fields interact might look something like this. Language description informs typology and formal theory of what exists and what needs to be explained. It has to be considered sort of its separate field because there are about 7,000 spoken languages in the world. No one focusing on formal theory or typology is going to learn all of them. Indeed, this is not even possible. So first, language description has to start by informing other fields of what is going on. Formal theory can then inform typology by predicting the range of possible variation among languages. So once you have your formal rules, you say, I expect to see this around the world. Is that true? Typology can then inform formal theory by giving the actual variation in the world. For example, if a formal theory predicts something to be possible and yet it never occurs to anyone's knowledge, that is bad for the formal theory, which will need to adjust. You might have noticed that NLP was off on its own. Why did I draw the picture that way? There are a few reasons. The first is the historical view inside natural language processing that, traditional linguists isn't really needed. Every time we fire a linguist, the performance goes up, as the sort of old infamous saying goes. And that was true for a while. There's another view that says NLP is basically a different field. NLP is a type of artificial intelligence or computational research. It's not really linguistics. Then there is the view that NLP is a consumer only with respect to the rest of linguistics. NLP is aided by linguistic research, but it doesn't really contribute back to the field. So that's why in this sort of traditional view, I have NLP in the bubble sitting off by itself. What I'm going to argue for is that it shouldn't be thought to be on its own, that NLP actually has a lot of linkages to other research themes in the field. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these red arrows, not so much the dashed one, because I think that's been explored by other people, even in this lecture series. Language description, I will argue, can signal to NLP researchers where computational difficulties might arise. Formal theory can provide frameworks and data annotation for NLP pipelines. We don't often think of data annotation as something that formal theory is providing to NLP, but it is. Probably the most famous example is the Penn Tree Bank, which has been of use for many decades, and the syntactic structures present in it come from formal theory. Typology can also give NLP researchers a map of the expected variation in the world and the implicational consequences of that variation. And finally, I think NLP can contribute to the rest of linguistic theory by refining the formal theories and by testing their applicability at scale. Some of the analyses simply will not scale over large corpora. And it can also identify holes in documentation and description. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the latter. So why am I interested in all of these relationships? Well, I did field work on an Indigenous Canadian language, Nuuchahnulth, as I mentioned. All my linguistic analyses in that process were implemented computationally. And I think that NLP has the potential, which has not yet come to be fully realized, to be useful for both revitalization and documentation efforts for small languages. A little bit more about me. I got my doctorate in 2019 from the University of Washington. My PhD work was on both documentation and computational grammar design. I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Zurich in the Department of Comparative Language Science. My primary interest is in minority American languages, so that is not the colonial languages of English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I have a particular interest in Wakashan and Nuuchahnulth, and my current work at the University of Zurich is mostly in typology. So the rest of the talk, or sort of the bulk of the talk, will be about the relationship between natural language processing and language documentation. I will look specifically at coordination in Nuuchahnulth and the relationship between NLP and typology. And I will use both coordination and category properties are part of speech properties. And a lot of this data is a reworking or extension of my dissertation. So a little bit about Nuuchahnulth before I dive into coordination. It's a Wakashan language from the South Wakashan branch of the family. The native speakers of Nuuchahnulth are all older, in very significant part from Canada's historic residential school policy, the aim of which was to stop the transmission of Indigenous languages from parent to child. It is a dialect continuum spoken among 13 tribes along the west coast of Vancouver Island. So here's a map of traditional Nuuchahnulth territory. The DT dot, Bachi dot, and Makah at the bottom belong to different but related languages. And everything from Huayet north is Nuuchahnulth speaking tribes. Linguistic work on this language is not particularly new. It goes back to the work of Edward Sapiers beginning in 1911. The largest published texts are in one of the dialects, the Berkeley Sound dialect, and most of the recent work has been focused on syntax, including my own work. For those of you interested in the typological profile of the language, it is highly polysynthetic. So here are two examples of particularly complicated words. Who will be first? And the second one is a full sentence on its own. He always gets hot. It has a large number of consonants, 35 compared with approximately 25 in English. It has aggressively second position syntax, something I'll talk about towards the end, and a sort of famously weak distinction between nouns and verbs. All of these features are true of Nuuchahnulth in particular, but they are also shared with the wider Pacific Northwest Sprachbund.